If we don't have election integrity, we lose America. Welcome to Freedom Alive. Every aspect of American life is built on the bedrock of trustworthy elections. As citizens, we have the privilege to vote and to have a voice in the direction of our government. Fair and free elections should never be a partisan issue, and the media should never censor the truth to favor one party. In 2009, Catherine Engelbrecht started True the Vote, a nonpartisan voters' rights organization called to protect the integrity of our elections. Catherine joins us to share why and how she's been fighting for Americans ever since. I'm blessed to again be joined by our co-host, Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, I consider Catherine one of those heroes who has been faithfully fighting for election integrity despite all the incredible opposition thrown at her.
And she's going to talk about some of that opposition post the 2020 election because she had videos that she did investigation on with regards to the drop boxes, some of these people dropping off ballots at 3 a.m. in the morning multiple times with rubber gloves and so forth, trying to protect their fingerprints from being on the multiple ballots they were putting in the mailboxes and the drop boxes. And yet she has been a stalwart on promoting free and fair elections. We need to have elections that are free of fraud. Everybody needs to have their vote counted, and not more than once, but not less than once. And consequently, that's what True the Vote is all about. They won a major victory recently in Georgia, and so she will tell us about that as well.
Can't wait. We have a lot to bring to you on this episode, but our Freedom Alert is next.
A Virginia court makes a common sense ruling. The Virginia Supreme Court ruled recently to reinstate a lawsuit that alleges a high school teacher's free speech and free exercise of religion rights were violated. The French teacher was fired for declining to refer to one of his female students by male pronouns. The ruling reverses a lower court's decision to dismiss the case, and now it moves forward to trial. In 2018, the West Point School Board fired the teacher because he would not refer to a gender-confused female student with a masculine pronoun. He tried to avoid the use of pronouns altogether, but school officials directed him to use her preferred pronoun. In his lawsuit, he stated he sincerely believes that referring to a female as a male by using an objectively male pronoun is telling a lie. The case will continue.
Up next, Matt's interview with Catherine Engelbrecht.
I want to welcome our very special guest, Catherine Engelbrecht, and she is the founder of True the Vote. It is a nonpartisan voter rights and education organization designed to have our elections be secure, fair, and have integrity in our election process. Catherine, you founded True the Vote going back to 2009, but became very well known following the 2020 election. Welcome, first of all, to Freedom Alive, and then take us back to 2009. Why did you found True the Vote, and what was the purpose? What do you do?
Well, True the Vote, the mission of True the Vote, as you rightly said, is to encourage citizens to take a stand for free and fair elections. And there's so many ways that citizens can be involved. Most people don't know. They don't know all the ways that you can serve in the process. But what started it all in 2009 was really an accident. It was a small group that decided we were trying to figure out what it was that we could do that would take this passion. It was during the time of the Tea Party, and how can we take the passion and translate it into meaningful, sustainable action? And we had heard that there was a need for people to work at the polls. There just simply weren't enough volunteers. And so it was just through that first effort, working at the polls and then coming back and comparing notes, we realized that there were some real problems and made us question, if this is what happens when people are watching, what happens when no one's there? And that has led to one question begat the next and the next and the next. And almost 15 years later, here we are.
I know in the election Governor Glenn Youngkin, when Republicans took over the House and the Senate in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and he won the governor's race. They were operating in a state at the time that still had some very serious problems with the election laws. But there was a lot of effort that took place there of people, just like what you're talking about, learning how to be involved in the election process, poll workers and so forth. Talk to people, because we're coming up to major elections every year, and certainly this year is a critical election in 2024. How can people get involved in making sure that their elections are secure?
Well, the first thing is it's just a mindset. You've got to lock in on the fact that just voting is no longer enough. You've got to vote and serve. If they go to truethevote.org and select in the resources area their state, we have all of the links and standards up for every single state and how you can serve, what you're in different state requirements. Every state manages their process a little bit differently, but what's consistent across all the states is that there are ways for citizens to engage. You can serve as an election worker, which is sort of in the hierarchy of positions. The most important is to make sure you have adequate polling place staff. So working as an election worker, that generally means you're going to work on behalf of the county. And in certain states, you have to be appointed by the party or candidate of your choice. Stepping down from that, you've got election or poll watchers, people that are observing. They're not talking to voters, but they're just observing the overall process. And then from there, you've got, outside of just the day's events at the polling place, you've got ways to work for early election. You've got central count responsibilities, absentee ballot review boards. There's so many ways to serve. And it's state dependent, but it's great to start now to figure out where you might find your fit in the primary and then in the general in November.
I know, talking to a number of people in the Virginia elections as an example, that was working on a template where you still had bad election laws. But you had this overwhelming response to elect Governor Youngkin and strong leaders and the attorney generals, just all across the board, a sea change in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, obviously, that was people that turned out, but it was also people that went to the polls and did exactly what you're saying. They got involved in the process. They were poll watchers. They isolated some of those particular areas of the election supervisors that might have the most problems in the past. And they were there to just observe, to make sure that there was no fraudulent activities that were taking place. It may not have eliminated all the fraud or all the wrongdoing, but it at least helped to reduce some of it. Is that one way people can get involved, especially as we come up to this important election?
Absolutely, yes. And then look, observation changes things. Just having honest eyes and ears. And if you're working as an election worker and, extra sets of hands to help the throughput of the process. When we started, as you asked earlier, what was the first impetus of really starting a full-on organization in 2009? One of the things that we observed early in was that just the process was so broken, largely because there were not enough hands on deck. So absolutely, being involved, making sure at every polling place you have adequate staffing is a huge part of creating an environment of trustworthy elections.
I know up until 2020, most of us probably thought that, this election fraud and the problems with election fraud, they're not here in our United States. Maybe here and there somebody votes twice or some other kinds of situations happen, but it's not very systemic or widespread. It happens in foreign countries. 2020 really, I think, shook a lot of people into a different reality. You were very involved and have been very involved in monitoring what happened in the 2020 elections. What have you seen in your investigation?
Oh, my word. 2020 was a perfect storm of subversion. Even before 2020 and into the earlier parts of 2019, we began to notice the rise in lawfare, the efforts to push new process, new standards. And when that became buttressed by the pandemic, well, it was just, wholesale changes, in the dark of night in ways that people weren't aware of. And it led to absolute chaos in process. You had the, private monies coming in, nearly $500 million funding inexplicably in the ability to move that much money that quickly, but they certainly did, into drop boxes, into third-party staffing that was managing ballot curing, things that we'd never seen before. Then the push to mass mail, all of that underpinned by chronically bad, inaccurate voter rolls. We created this domino effect of one bad move led to the next bad move, led to the next, all the way through to, of course, what we saw with the end result. And then when you begin to try to peel back the layers and evaluate how what we'd seen happen had come to pass, then you realize, oh, well, chain of custody documents are missing. Video cameras weren't working on the drop boxes. The level of attention to detail and the checks and balances that are required for an audit to help avoid repeating your problems was also lacking. So we just saw it all play out in 2020. A lot has been improved for 2024, but the one thing that the whole system depends on is engagement of the voter.
Now, let's talk about some of the ballots that happened. I know even before 2020, there was a bipartisan commission, and Jimmy Carter was one of the co-chairs of that commission. He had a Republican and he had a well-known Democrat that was co-chair of that commission. And one of the things they concluded was that the biggest area for fraud is these mail-in ballots, and that we had to reform that. Well, we never did reform it, and it really came to a head in 2020 with the pandemic and everything was mail-in. For those who say, well, I do a mail-in ballot, I do an absentee ballot because I can't be at the poll on that certain day. Talk about the difference between that typical kind of absentee ballot versus what we saw happen in 2020 with these mass mail-in ballots.
Sure. Well, again, it all starts with the bad data in the voter rolls. So when we saw this push to mass mail, that was necessarily dependent upon having accurate voter rolls to send out those ballots to. And because the rolls weren't accurate, we immediately, straight out of the blocks, created a problem with ballots going to addresses where the voters no longer lived, going to voters multiple times. So there was already just a stew of chaos happening because of the bad data that had now been catalyzed by these mass mailouts. Ideally, what should happen in an election is that your absentee ballots should be very narrow in scope. And you should really, culturally, we should strive to participate in person. That should be plan A. Plan B should be vote early in person. And then plan C, if you have no other alternative, is mail in the ballot. But that, of course, was flipped on its head during the pandemic and the election of 2020. And it's not going to come back. We've now, crossed over into a mindset where mail is so convenient. And so that's going to be the natural choice of many voters. The problems with the not just the bad voter rolls, but then the certainty of whether or not once you get that ballot, it's going to go through a dozen or so hands by the time you either choose to put it in your mailbox or into a drop box. So the certainty that it ever reaches its destination is questionable. The accuracy of the count is also questionable because in most states you don't have the requirement of providing ID back with your ballot. So that leads to many open-ended situations. It's just a bad move. And it's interesting about the Carter Foundation because in the 70s, they were out absolutely saying mail ballots are the least secure way to cast your vote. But they changed their tune in 2020 and said, oh, mail ballots are great. But ironically, even the United Nations does not recognize an election that is conducted primarily by mail because it's known globally that this is the least secure way to cast your ballot. And yet our country is pressing in that direction. So I hope that people wake up and try to cast those ballots in person if they can. But, convenience is tempting.
Now, I've seen video. A lot of it is great work that you have done in looking at some of these videos of the drop boxes where people come at, say, 3 o'clock in the morning and they're dropping off multiple ballots, and they're doing it more than once. And some of the time they have these, like surgical gloves, plastic gloves on their hands. You've done a lot of research in this area. One of the things that's so frustrating, whenever you read about someone who questions the 2020 election, the media always says, they're an election denier. In your experience, you spent many, many hours in this. Was there fraud in the 2020 election?
Oh,
and number one. And number two, was the fraud significant enough to change the outcome of the presidential race?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. And I would say when you evaluate what happened in the 2020 election and whether or not it was stolen, you really have to look at, it was a 1,000-front war, and you have to really evaluate all those fronts. The media was a big front. Suppression of information was another front. The injection of private dollars that changed the process was another. And so you layer these all together to get to the perfect storm that we saw. But with respect to the drop boxes, that was not in the works anywhere in 2019, but yet they managed to roll out a nationwide full scale effort. We felt like, and the reason that we chose to evaluate that particular link in the chain was because we felt like anything that had been so harried and so such a rush to inject it into the process likely was not going to be fully thought through in terms of the procedures and would lend itself to exploitation. And so that is, in fact, exactly what we found in the evaluation of the geospatial data that we bought, and then in coupling that with the video that was available. Yes, I mean, there's, we're talking about control of the free world at this point, and we should have no illusions that there are many that will go to any ends to see their desired candidate win.
Now, one of the things that you did, and I'd like for you to explain it in more detail, you did the geospacing, you did the geo-tracking with regards to cell phones, and you were able to track individuals that would go from a certain location to a drop box. Tell us what you did, what you found.
Sure. Well, we were aware that the data existed that was available for purchase to track people's movements using their cell phones. And what most people don't know about their cell phones is that every app you have on your phone is constantly sending out signals that include that are formed like packages of information and include the latitude and longitude, the timestamp, the elevation, and of course anything you may be searching on your phone. All of those things are bundled up and sent every few seconds from the apps on your phone. And for marketing companies and law enforcement and others, this is invaluable because it gives you a pattern of life. It shows you where you are traveling, and you can piece together by the pings coming out of your phone, the movements of the person with the phone. What we did was look at the drop boxes and establish what are called geofences. So the latitude and longitude around the box that we wanted to measure. And then using the data from the cell phones, we evaluated how many times pings went off from cell phones inside of the geofence that had been created around each drop box. And then from that, we did, iteration after iteration to determine whether or not a unique device was going multiple times to drop boxes. Ultimately, we also began to see in a certain sector of devices, just a small segment of the population, that they behaved very differently. So if you think about all of the behavior of people with cell phones on sort of a continuum, just like everything, you've got the bell curve where most people look, within a certain range, look about the same. Well, there was an outlier group that behaved in the various areas, jurisdictions that we studied. There was an outlier group that looked and behaved very, very differently. So that's the group that we ended up studying. And we learned that not only did they go to drop boxes repeatedly, and the hours in which they went were curious, but they were also going to nonprofit organizations. And all of those signals then formed into these patterns of life that we initially gave to the FBI and to local law enforcement. Sadly, they did nothing with it. And that's ultimately what spurred us on to make a movie.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to talk about, because you had about 5 or 6 nonprofits that you came up with. And somehow these nonprofits were getting ballots, and people were going to those nonprofits and they were getting ballots, and then you would find on your data tracking that that same cell phone, that same person would go to the nonprofit multiple times, and from the nonprofit go to a drop box, and then go to the nonprofit again, and go to the drop box again. And then you combined that cell tracking with actual, where it was available, video of that same person or other people coming at very odd hours of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. I remember one of those was like very early in the morning, dropping off these ballots. Another thing I think you found was there was a specific day, I believe it was in December of 2020, where there was a discussion in the media about finding fingerprints on one of the ballots. And the very next day, every person that was doing these multiple, what you would say being a mule, transporting these ballots, they had the surgical gloves that they began to wear. So there was some kind of incredible coordination going on with all these individuals.
Yeah, yes. And the story that you just referenced, the way this all broke out is that we had evaluated and had turned over information in Arizona to law enforcement. They began to do their own investigation into ballot trafficking in a border community called Yuma County. So as they began and the papers began to print that they were finding these ballots and ultimately the people responsible for casting them based on fingerprints on the ballots, that happened in Arizona. The day that came out in the paper, 24 hours later in Georgia, because early election was starting there for the runoff, that was the January 5th runoff to determine 2 Senate seats. That's when we saw on video many of the individuals in question begin to wear gloves, but they wore gloves. Masks, of course, is a little less questionable because of the pandemic. But then there was also the instance of seeing them take pictures as they were putting the ballots in. They would take pictures, and that was consistent with what whistleblowers told us. And they would they would wear the gloves, and once they would put the ballots in the drop box, then they would take the gloves off and throw it in a nearby trash can. So obviously something's going on that's not legit. You turned this information over to the FBI authorities, and what happened after that? Well, I mean, I look back on all of that and I just think, how naive, I don't even know what to think. I mean, I want to say how naive, but really we did the best that we could, thinking that this was the appropriate path to pursue because this was interstate. This was what we thought we were looking at was RICO level crimes and coordination. And of course, we could only take it so far. It was dependent upon law enforcement to step in and take it the rest of the way. It was only law enforcement that could have de-anonymized the devices and determine, which individuals actually belong to the device and further the cause of the investigation. But the FBI, as we now know, wasn't holding up its end of the bargain, made it very, very difficult. And, it's a heartbreak. Of all of the things I could have anticipated going wrong in the research project, the one thing I really didn't give consideration to was that such a politicized and weaponized law enforcement community wouldn't even try. And instead of going after the wrongdoers, they started to come after you. Correct. And it's unbelievable. I mean, the corruption that, in your experience, was revealed with regards to the fraud of the election and within the FBI is astounding. It's astounding. And yet you still press forward. And so as we're going through this next several months and we're moving to the November election, for example, are you hopeful that there's been significant changes? And obviously, one other aspect is, are you hopeful enough people will understand the importance of getting involved? I believe so, yes. I'm very encouraged about 2024. I've been doing this a long time, and it's been hard to see over the years the apathy of people just, assuming that, we, as you rightly point out, sort of we rattle sabers about election fraud as, in the run up to the election, but then in the aftermath and in the overall process that really requires constant eternal vigilance, we fall short. That has not been the case since 2020. Since 2020, people have stayed engaged. They're ready to serve. We've gotten a lot of good new process and new legislation that has helped refine the process and, or even certain instances, sort of roll it back to what it was before 2020. So we're seeing the removal of drop boxes, the lessening of mail ballots, sort of, wholesale mail out of mail ballots, inclusion of voter ID as a standard. So there's been a lot of improvement, but the biggest improvement of all is that citizens have stayed engaged, and that's going to make all the difference.
And thanks a lot to your efforts and your bravery, and you're willing to just do whatever is necessary, even pay a huge price for founding True the Vote and staying true to your founding principles. Catherine Engelbrecht is our guest, founder of True the Vote. And Catherine, people can go to your website, truethevote.org. That's truethevote.org. I encourage them to do so. Get involved in this and all future elections. Our freedom, frankly, depends upon it. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Matt, the point that Catherine made about voting no longer being enough, but our mission really now as individuals is to vote and serve.
Yeah, voting is critically important, and it is not a political act. It really is extending our biblical values to our everyday life. Mm-hmm. And so we shouldn't look at it in a negative way. We should look at it not as a duty or not as a privilege per se, but as a duty. I mean, it is a privilege, but it's something essential that we have to do. We need to vote, and we need to vote consistent with our biblical values. Meaning not based upon somebody's party or somebody who's a friend or that you know someone, but based upon your biblical values. But beyond that, it's very critical to get involved in the process.
Mm-hmm. The epiphany to me also was just her point about the whole system, or really whole election system, relies upon the engagement of the voter, even at the point of just working in the elections themselves. And it was really how she founded her ministry.
Yeah, after the 2020 election, we did some research on some of the voting efforts that the United States did in Afghanistan and other repressive countries after they were overthrown and you had to bring in elections. And the kind of security and identification process and even fingerprints that were done were incredibly higher standards that we were exporting into foreign countries like Afghanistan to make sure that they had secure elections than we were allowing here or requiring here in the United States. And we were like a backwoods third world country, how we did 2020 with regards to the drop boxes and the mail-in mass ballots and the ballot harvesting.
Mm-hmm. Amen. In closing, remember Proverbs 21, verse 15, which says, "When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. So join us here next time where you'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.